your attention up here, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Willard Lyman Brooks. I was born in 1808 in Bristol, Connecticut, the son of farmers, Solomon and Hannah Brooks. I had three brothers, Charles, Isaac, and Byron, and two sisters, Emily and Elvira. In 1828, when I was 20, Charles and I went to work with Charles Sanford as peddlers. We dealt in quality goods such as silks, velvets, and brocaded dress patterns. Also, silver earrings and teaspoons, and other items such as that. I kept very detailed accounts in a taped notebook that I carried in my pocket in Batavia, New York. I kept the names of every customer and everything sold. In those early days, it wasn't always for money. Neighbors' names went on the left side of the page and my name on the right. I listed what I sold them and what they gave in return, properly valued. About every 6 months, they would balance out, and whoever was in debt to the other would somehow settle the account with a bushel of potatoes or a promissory note. I married my first wife, Lucina Sanford, who just happened to be the sister of Charles Sanford, in 1834. With my wife, my infant daughter Mary, and my brother Charles and Isaac, we decided to move to Michigan when it was admitted to the Union in 1837. It was a long journey with 2 yoke of cattle and 2 carts made into a wagon. We drew straws to see who would walk and who would drive the lead team. Charles drew the short straw and had to walk. When we reached Jackson, Michigan, we couldn't go any further with the team, and so we joined up with William Churchill, another immigrant from the East, and came to Portland with us, and built a flat-bottom boat. And with our families, household goods, and about a year's worth of provisions, descended the Grand River to Portland. Well, the spring floods were high and muddy, with dangerous driftwood jams and rocks just below the surface. The raft crashed against a rock near what is Centerline Bridge, and many of our provisions fell into the river, and we were all in danger of being drowned. Finally, we landed in Danby Township, which at that time was still part of Portland. As a surveyor, I surveyed 160 acres of land in Section 3 in Danby, off of what is now Shala Highway. We started building our log homes and began the process of clearing the land. Fireplaces were made of stone and our chimneys of sticks and mud. Later, our small community would gather for barn and house raisings, but our first homes were very rough, and we were among the first white settlers of Danby. Well, we always maintained a good relationship with the native people who lived in the township. While civil and neighborly, our customs were very different. Once, when my wife and I were gone, a party of natives called, and finding only the hired girl, Clarissa Barber, and the children at home, they went into the yard and shot several fowls. And bringing them into the house, ordered the hired girl to cook them. Well, with some degree with fear and all possible haste, cooking was done, and the natives were curiously examining the log cabin and its contents. Dinner was placed on the table, and the natives, in perfect good humor, were seated and enjoying it. Well, when we returned, the only thing I could give them was a hearty welcome, sit down, and join the meal. In 1838, In order to gain better access to the mills and shops of Portland, A.F. Bell and I later rode from our farms to Portland, which is now Sherlaw Highway. And during this time, I maintained a bartering relationship with many of the merchants, trading grain and honey, eggs, butter, and other goods and services for household necessities. Well, some of those transactions were devious and complicated. Well, one time I took a load of wood to James Newman, which he paid for with flour, and then I took the flour for credit at the store, and then when I went to the blacksmith and traded part of the store credit to get a wheel fixed, and then back at the store used another part of the flour for groceries. So I took part of the flour home, got the wheel fixed, and still had some credit at the store. It was a day's work. No cash traded hands. My book showed I used less than $150 cash in 1 year. By 1842, I had 4 children: Mary, Charles S., Emily, and Milo. In 1843, my wife Lucina joined with 7 other people to form the Congregational Society. Though not a member, I donated some money for the church bell several years later. Unfortunately, we lost our child Mary that same year. L.B. Barnum made her a coffin for $5. Then in 1844, Barnum had to make a second coffin, costing $9.10 for the passing of my wife, Lucina. It took me 2 years to pay for the coffins, and I paid for them with oats. Lucina passed away, leaving me 3 children under the age of 6. In August of 1844, I married Nancy Reed of Riley Township in Clinton County. She was the daughter of pioneers also, John and Phoebe Reed. With Nancy, I had 4 additional children: John Willard, Mary Lucina, Polly, and Ellen. Well, I was always an entrepreneur, and I did different things. In addition to farming, I took on some other prizes, including shoe repair, managing Charles Sanford's property, he didn't even live in Michigan, and bartering many commodities and service. I never lost the peddler's instinct. Then I became a licensed distributor of whiskey, which paid off many of the debts. The IRS, though, regularly checked to be sure I paid on that whiskey. I did a lot of hauling by horse and wagon, often to that Dutch settlement, Westphalia, and to Lansing, hauling lumber for the new state capitol building, and later to Detroit to obtain goods for Portland merchants, especially James Newman. I was also a land surveyor, sold scrap iron during the American Civil War, whatever I could do to take care of my family. Despite all my efforts, cash was always scarce, so most business was done by the barter system. Trade works for goods. Danby was attached to Portland until 1845, when it was organized as a township. It was proposed to call it Brookstown, but since there already was a town by that name in the state, it was decided to call it Danby, as it was shorter and easy name to remember. I was very active in the early government of Danby Township, holding many offices, including assessor, election inspector, overseer of highways, and overseer of the poor. Charles and my families grew, and our farms prospered. Log cabins were replaced by frame houses. I once hired William Densmore in 1855 to pick out lumber for the house, to make sills and window frames, and to frame the house, for which I paid $29.55. Mine still remains on Charlotte Highway. Barns were also built. We were able to purchase more goods to make life easier. But at the age of 72, just 3 years before my death in 1883, I finally paid off the last mortgage on my farm. We had a hard but satisfying life. We were fortunate in that, with one exception, Mary, all our children reached adulthood. And nearly all my children, and those of my brother Charles, married local people. Many, the children of our fellow pioneers of Danby. And we remained in the area. I am surrounded by family and descendants here in Portland and many more in Danby Cemetery. This is the house on Charlotte Highway. And that is my second wife.
A striking resemblance there, Richard.
Whereabouts on Charlotte Highway was that house?
I think it's just before the cemetery. It's on the right-hand side, just before the cemetery.
Down by the curves, right?
Yeah, down by the curves.
Okay, thank you, sir.
You're good to go.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Harvey Knox, and I'd like to welcome you to my family plot. I'm here to share with you today my story of how my family came to be in Portland. I was born in November of 1826 to John Knox and Sally Moore Knox in Russell, St. Lawrence County, New York State. When I was just 8 years old, my father decided to follow in the footsteps of his father-in-law, my Grandpa Moore, and moved the family to the wild territory of Michigan. This was almost 3 years before Michigan would be admitted to the Union as the 26th state. So father and mother packed up our household goods and we traveled to Michigan by boat, along with my older brother Alanson and my younger sister Anna. Papa had just $1.06 to his name when we arrived in Detroit, yet somehow he was able to hire a team to transport us to Pontiac. We stayed in Pontiac for 10 days, waiting for Grandpa Moore to meet us. Grandpa Moore had borrowed a team of oxen to help us complete the journey to our new home in the Grand River area. I don't know how Father was able to provide food and shelter for those 10 days with so little money. I imagine he worked as a day laborer or perhaps bartered for the things we needed. It was a very difficult journey from Pontiac. The landscape was completely forested and wild. There were no roads to speak of. One night, a terrible thunderstorm and 4 trees were struck by lightning very near where we were camped. It gave us quite a fright. But after 4 days' journey, we arrived at Philo Bogue's place on the Grand River in what is now known as Portland. Mr. Bogue was my uncle, married to my mother's sister, and not the only resident in the area. The Perrins, who Grandpa Moore had borrowed the oxen from, had a place about a mile up the Grand River across from Island Number 1. And John Milne had built a place downstream near where Portland Products is today. We stayed with the Bogues for a short time and then moved on to Grandpa Moore's place, which was 3 miles this side of Lyons. By now it was fall, so Father built a log shanty and we spent the winter there. We shared the area with Native Americans who were generally friendly toward us, but there were also many wild animals like bears and wolves who were not so friendly towards us. One night, a wolf sneaked in and stole one of the few pigs that Father had managed to procure. Grandpa Moore was familiar with the habit of wolves and knew it would return to get more pigs. So, the next night, Grandpa Moore laid in wait with his gun and got the wolf before it could cause any more hardship to our family. In the spring, Father took up 40 acres in Portland Township, and our family, which now included my baby sister Phoebe, moved to our permanent home. I was just 9 years old, but my brother and I helped Father clear the land, plant, and harvest. But it wasn't all work in those days. There were also opportunities to visit neighbors and go to social gatherings. When I was 11 years old, in 1837, our community got its first post office. Oh, you can just imagine the excitement. It had been so difficult staying in touch with family back in New York State, but now we had mail delivery once every week. It would be 9 more years, when I was 20 years old, before we would receive daily mail, which was delivered by coach instead of the slower horseback. My family was a member of the Methodist Church, which held its first meeting at Philo Bogue's place in 1834. In those early days, we had circuit rider preachers who would travel to different towns to preach, which meant we didn't always have a Sunday service. Even important events like weddings would just have to wait until the preacher came back to town. But in 1838, when I was 12 years old, our church finally had a designated minister named Brother Blowers. It was at this time that my mother became a privileged member of the Methodist Church, having originally been Congregationalist. Services continued to be held at Philo Bogue's place until he died in 1839, or at the log schoolhouse. It would be almost 30 more years before Reverend Chartwell would settle in Portland and lead the congregation in building a formal church building on the corner of Bridge Street and Elm Street in 1865. Meanwhile, I was becoming a young man, and Portland was becoming a vibrant community. More people had settled the area, and businessmen had created employment opportunities that didn't involve farming. There were grain mills, sawmills, stores, blacksmith shops, and other services. There was also a successful lawyer in the area who had a sister named Fidelia Blanchard. Oh, I fell in love with her. And we married in 1853 when I was 27 years old. We bought a farm next to my father's, but I never enjoyed farming. So, when someone offered to lease the farm from me, I took the offer and moved into the village to work in my brother-in-law's store. My brother-in-law, W.R. Churchill, was married to my younger sister Anna. Fidelia and I eventually moved to Matherton, where I learned more about business by apprenticing as a clerk. Sadly, it was at this time that my dear wife died in 1860. We had been married just 7 years. I returned to Portland and entered partnership with my brother-in-law, Mr. Churchill, who was also an early settler in Portland, so we had much in common. When Churchill retired, I took over the business. I never did return to farming, but continued to buy land and lease it to others to farm. I married my second wife, Adelia White, in 1861 when I was 35 years old. We were blessed with 3 children, although 2 died in infancy. Frederick, born in 1869, was our only child that grew to adulthood. In addition to being an active member of the Methodist Church, I was also involved in local politics, served on the village council, and was a staunch supporter of the temperance movement. I was on the temperance committee at church and a member of the Prohibition political party. I was even a party delegate to the Prohibition State Convention in 1884, which was held in Ionia. Now, as a trustee on the village council, I was involved in the notorious Parker versus Village of Portland dispute, in which Mr. Parker wished to sell liquor in the village. I was strongly opposed, of course. A village council meeting was called to vote on his bond request, which was rejected because of my opposition. Parker was not satisfied with the decision and asked Judge Morse from Ionia to come argue his case at another council meeting. I allowed the judge to present his case, but when he was finished, I adjourned the meeting before a vote, letting the decision of the previous council stand. That judge was furious, but I was able to keep saloons out of Portland for another year. Adelia and I built a beautiful house on the corner of Bridge Street and Smith Street, right next to the Methodist Church. This is where our son Frederick grew up, and when he married Bessie Tone in 1893, it was also here that they started their family. They had 2 children, Helen in 1894 and Fred Jr. in 1900, both of whom I adored. In 1907, Frederick completely remodeled the house and added modern conveniences to make Adelia and I more comfortable in our declining years. It was here that I passed away in 1908 at the age of 82. My son Frederick would follow me into business. He attended business school in Ionia, then returned to Portland, where he started a produce business, was a partner in the Portland Milling Company, and a trustee of the Maynard and Allen Bank, even becoming bank president when Charles Maynard died. Frederick was a charter member of the Ionia County Road Commission and even served a term as president of the State Road Commission. He also followed my example in acquiring land to lease, owning over 500 acres in the Portland area by the time he died in 1935. My grandson, Fred Jr., earned a master's degree in accounting from Michigan Agricultural College, now Michigan State University. He married Thelma Moyer and had 1 son, Kendall. He continued to operate the elevator until it was sold to the Portland Cooperative. Now, my great-grandson Kendall married Betty Shire in 1955. They bought my father's farm on Knox Road and began growing crops, later switching to dairy farming. Kendall had 4 daughters, Beth, Karen, Barbara, and Kathy. Today, it is my great-great-granddaughter Barbara and her husband that continue to operate the family farm. Now think back to my father arriving in Detroit over 185 years ago with a family to care for and just $1.06 in his pocket. Imagine the courage it took to settle in a wild new territory. But also notice the legacy he was able to leave here in Portland because of that courage. Again, my name is Harvey Knox. Thank you for visiting my family's plot. It has been my honor to relate to you the story of how my family came to be in Portland. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jessie Louisa Collison Arnold. I was born June 24th, 1894 in London, England. From my bedroom window, I could see the Big Ben, just 3 blocks away across the River Thames. My parents owned a large house at 71 Lambeth Road, where we took in boarders, but my mother was by trade a professional seamstress.
And my name is Clarence Benton Arnold, but you can call me Ben. I was born January 20th, 1898 in East Liverpool, Ohio. My father, Philip, had emigrated from Germany 9 years earlier to join his brothers in the woodworking trades, making furniture and wooden caskets. He lived in Canton, Ohio, and then Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he met my mother, Myrtle. They moved back to Canton until 1901, where my parents, older brother Lawrence, and I moved to Brantford, Ontario, Canada to establish business there.
I had a lovely childhood growing up in London, and as I grew up, I followed in my mother's profession and became a professional seamstress.
Although the furniture business in Canada sounded promising, my father struggled mightily, and in 1911, my mother took my brother and I and moved back to Grand Rapids to be with her family. But Lawrence and I were miserable. We missed our father and we missed our friends, so we ran away, hitchhiking our way right back to where we considered home, Canada. My parents divorced in 1913. I finished high school in Brantford, where I was on the speed skating team and also played a bit of semi-pro hockey.
When I completed my apprenticeship as a seamstress for Parliament, I received a thimble made of rose-colored gold. I cherished that thimble. My job was to make wigs, robes, and clothing for the members of Parliament.
It was 1915 when World War I was being waged in Europe. The United States was not yet involved, but as a citizen of Canada, my brother Lawrence enlisted. I was not about to let my brother go to war without me, and so I, lying about my age, enlisted as well.
My employment had put me in close contact with the members of Parliament, and I became romantically involved with a high-ranking member. We became engaged to be married.
I was a very good marksman, or sharpshooter. I could speak fluent German, French, and of course English. All of which led to me being in charge of 600 of the 2,400 guns of the Black Watch Division. The Black Watch was also known as the Royal Highland Regiment, an elite group known for their marksmanship and valor. The Watch went over the top, meaning they came out of the trenches and attacked the Germans on the front lines at Cambrai in France.
In September of 1916, while London was under siege from the German Zeppelin airship raids, and my friends, family, and neighbors were sent fleeing for our lives as fiery balls fell from the sky upon us, my fiancé bought his way out of the military.
Initially, the attack seemed a success, but the Germans launched a brutal counterattack, and before long we were overtaken. Of all 2,400 guns, only 120 survived, I being one. Unconscious and left for dead in enemy territory, I lay for 3 days with only the flesh of my cheek holding my jaw together. When I was found, most of my clothes and of course my boots had been stripped from me, and my rescuers were shocked to find that I was still alive. I woke up in a London hospital where I spent the next 9 months in recovery, most of it flat on my back.
My fiancé's decision to use his wealth and influence to keep him safe while the rest of us struggled to survive was more than I could accept. As I watched the other men, young and old, go off to fight, while I could not see him as anything but a coward, I realized that if we did live through this, I could never marry him, so I broke our engagement. Even as I continued to work as a seamstress, I helped my parents with the boarding house. We still had celebrities stay with us, like the famous opera singer, Ed Barr, but more of our rooms became home for military personnel as war raged on.
My injury, although serious, did not exclude me from continuing service to my country, but it did keep me out of combat for the rest of the war. I was still a member of the Canadian Overseas Expeditionary Force, but instead of being a sharpshooter, I carried a sharp pencil and worked for the accounting office in London. My residence was 71 Lambeth Street, Eliza Collison's boarding house, and to my surprise, I found my brother Lawrence, also wounded, had been assigned to London and was living there as well.
With my mother's boarding house completely full all the time, I spent more and more time helping her with laundry, cooking, and of course sewing and mending. Lots of mending, as you didn't waste anything, not even a scrap of cloth. Speaking of scraps, remember Ed Barr, the opera singer? He had a pastime for making crazy quilts, using pieces of fabric from old costumes. On his stays with us, he, mother, and I would spend any free time we had relaxing our weary brains and working on our sewing together.
If you could say that a person could be happy in the middle of a war, I guess I was. My dear brother was alive and with me. I was alive, and the owners of the house I lived in had a beautiful, charming, delightful daughter, whom I was thrilled to spend suppers and evenings with most of the time.
I thought Lawrence and Clarence were so honorable and brave. I admired them both very much. Clarence was especially kind and attentive to me, and before too long I realized that I had fallen in love with this brave soldier.
I was, without a doubt, in love with her. My brother approved, but I worried about asking her to marry me because, after the war, I was going back to the United States, where I had dual citizenship. My father had returned from Canada and was now living in Grand Rapids. I need not have worried, though. She accepted my proposal, and we were married on August 15th, 1918 at Lambeth Place Church. The war was not yet over, but my service was, and victory was close at hand. So with my new bride, I boarded a ship and steamed off for America.
Although I was very much in love, the idea of leaving my home, family, and country completely terrified me. London was in shambles, and the guilt of leaving was almost more than I could bear. My parents reassured me that they would be all right, and enthusiastically, though I believe much fiend, encouraged me to go. I packed my meager belongings along with my rose thimble and a lovely crazy quilt, a wedding gift from Ed Barr.
I secured employment with the Valley City Milling Company, and we lived with my father and grandmother in the family home near the Wealthy Street Baptist Church.
We had a lovely large garden, something I had longed for at home, but the streets of London did not provide much room for vegetable gardens. I obtained my employment at Helpensheimer's department store, doing alterations, and when harvest came, I spent many of my evenings and days off canning fruit and vegetables. The war had left the memory of hunger in its wake, and I diligently preserved every morsel of food for lean times, as I feared they would come again.
But for now, times were good. We were all happy and safe, and I had been promoted to a position of authority at the Portland facility of Valley City Milling. So in 1923, we moved into a large house on Looking Glass Avenue.
We were doing so well that my darling Ben arranged a trip home to London for me. We had recently lost our first child, a little boy we named Benny, and I was grieving and very homesick. The trip was wonderful and rejuvenating, and not long after my return, we welcomed our daughter Colleen, and quite soon after that came Donna and Richard.
Now, as I said, times were good for now. Even as the markets crashed, the mills kept going, and the farmers kept growing. But one thing we could not have anticipated was the mill fire.
We had to sell our big house on Looking Glass Avenue and bought a more modest home at 326 Hill Street. I did not mind moving, and I set about making this new house our home by planting my garden.
I owned a Model A, which was very fortunate because I secured employment with the Department of the Secretary of State for the state of Michigan, and that was in Lansing. That was not the easy ride that you enjoy these days. It was a 2-track almost all the way. It was 1937, and the country was in a terrible depression. Other men in the area would share their gas rations with me in exchange for a ride. Often the passenger compartment was full, and those fellows would stand on the running boards and hang on the whole way.
We went on raising our children and occasionally getting a visit from my family in England. My sister Edith visited once, and my brother Harry came several times. I always enjoyed having him join me in the Congregational Church Choir. He often took a solo because he was a very accomplished singer.
World War II. Words I thought I would never have to say. Europe was once again at war, but now I was too old to fight and happy for it. In honesty, after my experience in war, I never cared much for guns and never shot one again.
In 1943, my beloved London was once again under attack, this time with much more accuracy. The River Thames was an easy landmark for the airplanes, and a missile fell straight through the roof of 71 Lambeth Road and down to the cellar before exploding. My family home was completely destroyed, and upon seeing the destruction, my father dropped dead of a heart attack right there amidst the ruins.
Finally, the war ended and we were at peace again. I continued with the Secretary of State until 1964, when at 66 years of age, I retired. I didn't sit at home though. I was a member of the Kiwanis and a past master of Masonic Lodge 31. I decided to enter politics and successfully ran for the village council. I had the honor of being on the last village council, and when the village transitioned into a city in 1969, a member of the first city council. There were growing pains for our young city. Some citizens were not happy with the city manager, the way the city was being operated, and the way personnel issues were being handled. A recall drive naming the mayor, Fred Enroe Jr., myself, and Marvin Sanborn was initiated. At that time, I was Mayor Pro Tem and had served for 9 years. The recall was successful. My family and I were deeply hurt by the results. I had carried out my duties faithfully and done what I had thought was best for my fellow citizens.
I had always been involved with the Congregational Church, singing in the choir, sewing their robes, and always picking flowers from my lovely English-style garden to adorn the church altar. We celebrated 60 years of marriage.
I developed cancer and died on January 1st, 1979.
I suffered from dementia in a later part of my life and died just 2 years after he did, on February 4th, 1981.
Oh yes. Did you ever wonder why the Canadian flag flies over the cemetery along with the American flag? Well, it's because of me. Actually, because of my service in World War I. My daughter Colleen was instrumental in getting the flag flown in memory of my service as a Canadian veteran.
Well, thank you so much for coming today. I'm Blanche Neller. My husband Bert and I are laid to rest at this site. Bert was born May 19th of 1889 in Olive in Clinton County, near current-day DeWitt. His parents, Theodore and Mary, had 5 children. Bert, his 3 brothers, Fenton, Elton, and Earl, and and his sister Rachel. His dad's family emigrated from Germany to Canada before settling in Michigan, and his mother's family moved from New York to Olive, where she was born. Throughout Bert's youth, his dad supported the family of 7 by working as a carpenter, making, among other things, coffins. I was born to William Harvey Dunham and Ola Bell Whaley Dunham on May 1st of 1893 in DeWitt. My dad was a tinsmith and worked in a hardware store in DeWitt. My brother Lee and I lost my mother when I was just 8 years old. My father remarried and with his new wife had my stepsister Lena. Eventually, Bert and I separately made our way to Lansing, where we met. I worked as a stenographer and was a member of the First Methodist Church of Lansing. Bert worked as a mail carrier and was also a member of the First Methodist Church, where he was active in the Epworth Group, a group for young adults ages 18 to 35. We were married when I was 20 on September 9th, 1913, a Wednesday. The Epworth Group gave us a lovely shower, and the Tuesday before our Wednesday wedding, my Sunday school class threw a shower for me at the teacher's home. I received many practical gifts. After our wedding, we remained active in the church, and Bert was an officer in the Letter Carriers Union. He also purchased an acre of land on Turner Street in Lansing, where we built a combination garage and summer home and put in a huge garden. I became a member of the International Letter Carriers Auxiliary, a group that works with legislators to advocate for the families and letter carriers. I had stopped working as a stenographer and became a full-time homemaker, helping to care for that sizable garden that Bert put in for us. Even though Bert was active in the union, he knew he didn't want to work as a mail carrier his entire life. Because his dad, being a carpenter, had made coffins, he gained an interest in learning to embalm and become an undertaker. He enrolled and graduated from Cincinnati Embalming School, and for a time was employed by J.J. Sullivan in Cincinnati before returning to Lansing and taking a job with the W.H. Joy Undertaking Company. Eventually, Bert decided he would rather work for himself than someone else, so we opened our own undertaking business in East Lansing. That first year, we only conducted 4 funerals. The second year, 7. I wanted to help Bert more with the business, so I became an embalmer myself. I was the only female embalmer in the area. I specialized in women and babies. During that time, we were not just an undertaking business. We needed to supplement our income. So we sold furniture and operated a dray transportation service. A dray is a flat wagon that's horse-drawn, and it's usually used for carrying cargo. We would meet college students and others at the train and bus station, and then transport them and their luggage to campus. In addition to the businesses in East Lansing, Bert also ran on the Republican ticket for the office of coroner in Ingham County. Coroners go out to the scenes of accidents and investigate suspicious deaths. I was so proud of him when he was elected. He ran again in 1928 and was re-elected. While in office, he was instrumental in working with the Attorney General's office to refine the role of the coroner and the rules that regulate the person in that role. It was ruled, among other things, that a person in charge of hospitals must report to the coroner and notify them when victims of accidents die in hospitals. In 1930, the State Coroners Association elected Bert their secretary-treasurer. While Bert was busy with the business and the duties of coroner, I was also busy, not just with the business, but with the groups at church, and I joined the Zonta Club, now an international organization that advocates for women's rights. At that time, we were a group of local businesswomen. Despite our efforts, by 1930, we were experiencing some financial difficulties. The dray service and later ambulance service were causing a drain on our finances because of several lawsuits that were brought against us. One resulted in a $4,500 judgment against us because our driver hit a streetcar and a gentleman died. We had no liability insurance, so we had to pay the entire amount. To help with that situation, we partnered with Stanley Smith, and our business became the Neller Smith Funeral Company on East Michigan Avenue. I was secretary, and Bert was vice president. By this time, we were no longer undertakers. We were morticians. We were busy at home, too. Bert's parents were living with us, and we had taken in a young cousin who named Harvey Benson. Harvey was an orphan who lost his father in 1912 when he was just 3, and then his mother when he was just 5. After his mother's death, Harvey lived in orphanages and foster homes. And in 1923, when Harvey was about 14 years old, we were asked to take him in as we had no children of our own. We never formally adopted Harvey, but he took our name in 1942 legally. In 1932 was an eventful year. I had taken classes and renewed my license, as was now required by law. Bert's father passed away. We opened a new business in Portland and filed for the voluntary dissolution of the Neller Smith Funeral Home. The corporation was dissolved in January of 1933. However, we retained the funeral home on Michigan Avenue and continued to conduct funerals there until 1942. In 1932, we conducted 1 funeral in Lansing and 14 in Portland. In June of 1932, we bought a beautiful home on the corner of Bridge and Maple that had previously been owned by Charles T. Lockwood. It was built in 1860 by William R. Churchill, a well-known merchant in Portland. We bought it for dual purpose. It would be both our residence and our business. In addition to running a funeral home, we operated an ambulance service. Of course, at that time, they weren't called ambulance services, they were called invalid cars, and they were used for more than emergencies. For example, we would take expectant mothers to the hospital or to Mrs. Gensterbloom's maternity home on Albro Street, and then we would bring them home a few days later with their new baby. On December 2nd, 1933, Harvey married a local Portland girl named Dorothy Ellen Snow. Interestingly, they too had met at the Methodist Church with the Epworth Group. Even though he hadn't taken steps to legally use our name, he married Dorothy using the name Neller. There were now 2 Mr. and Mrs. Nellers in Portland. Harvey became a mortician and partnered with us in the business. He purchased the business from us September 1st, 1945. In 1950, he expanded the business by buying out Banfield's, our only competition in Portland. Over time, I realized I was called to be a minister. I became an ordained minister in the Nazarene Church and led the Nazarene congregation here in Portland beginning in 1934. Our grandson Keith saved the sign you see here. As a minister, I would often be called to conduct funerals at the funeral home. After Bert retired, we were free to move, so I accepted calls to other churches. I became a Methodist minister in 1951 and served churches in Mears, Smith's Corners, Elbridge. From 1956 to 1958, I served in Vickerville and Fenwick, and 1 year in Perry, Florida. I retired from active ministry in 1961. We bought a home on Riverside Drive in Portland, as Harvey and his family were living on the Bridge Street home. Harvey was always on call. Dorothy and Harvey had 2 children, a son and a daughter. Their son Keith graduated from mortuary school in 1961 and joined his father in the business. For our 50th wedding anniversary, the family gave us a lovely party at the Methodist Church. 3 of our attendants were able to join us. By this time, Bert was beginning to slow down. His arthritis was getting worse, and eventually we moved into the Ionia Manor Convalescent Home. Bert died there, just past our anniversary, on September 22nd, 1968. I died shortly thereafter, January 1st, 1969. The Neller Funeral Home continued to operate under the direction of Harvey and Keith. Harvey died in 1993. Keith retired and eventually sold to Lehman's, although he continues to work there occasionally. Thank you.
There you go. Oh yeah, everybody, I need your name tags back. Here, I've got another plastic bag here if you want to put them in a plastic bag.
And then we have